Okay, I think we'll make a start. Welcome everyone who's tuning in from home to the next edition of Oxford Development Talks. I'm Alexander Betts. This is a lecture series that's jointly convened by the Oxford Department of International Development and the Oxford Society for International Development, a student society. And what we're trying to do is have a series of talks, discussions, debates, that really make the best of Oxford's research on international development accessible to a wider public audience. So this is a series that's intended to be for an Oxford audience, an academic audience, but broader than that, for people with an interest in international development at a time when international development perhaps matters more than ever. So I'm really delighted that the second of our speakers in the series is Professor Xiaolan Fu, who is Professor of Technology and International Development at the Oxford Department of International Development. Xiaolan is founding director of the Technology and Management Center for International Development, TCMD, in the Department of International Development. She's a fellow of Green Templeton College in Oxford, and she's written a number of books and publications that have, I think, real resonance for the current context. One of her books is called China's Role in Global Economic Recovery. I can't think of a more relevant book title that we could see today. Another of her books is China's Path to Innovation. And as well as being a scholar, Xiaolan has prolific contributions to policy and practice. She's served, for instance, on the United Nations Secretary General's high-level advisory group of the United Nations Technology Facilitation mechanism. So we're really thrilled to have you with us, Xiaolan. We're going to do this as an interview style format. So you and I are going to have a discussion and really open up the topic of China's growth strategy and what it means for the rest of the world. This is really important in normal circumstances. It's particularly important today. China, in a way, was the first in, but also potentially the first out of the coronavirus, and is in a position potentially to be very important to the future trajectory of the global economy. So I wondered if we could just start with a very general question, Xiaolan. I wondered if you could give us a bit of a brief overview of the history of China's growth strategy and where we are today.
Thank you, Alex. About China's growth strategy, I think there are two major milestones in China's development strategy. One is 1978, another is 2006. Of course, we can include this year, 2020, as the third one. I will tell you why. First, is before 1978, China's growth was driven mainly by import substitution-based industrialization. It was a self-sufficient closed economy, followed the former Soviet Union model. So China was remained as a low-income country over that period since until then. And the change took place in 1978 when the government started to reforms and opening up. And the development strategy then changed to import from import substitution to export promotion based industrialization strategy. And today, compared to many other emerging economies, China is the most open one. The GDP, trade to GDP ratio, and it's about 40%, much higher than India and Brazil and other developing countries. Its inward FDI is second in the world. Outward FDI is also now surging. So exports, investment plus reforms are the major driver of the growth since 78. And until 2006, the Chinese government started to put innovation at the center of its innovation strategy, and pursuing the transformation to from an innovation imitator to an innovator, from an imitator to an innovator, and also try to develop the economy to be an innovation-driven economy through structural change and innovation. So there are two other features in the recent development strategy of China is that they emphasize sustainable green transformation, and second is building a harmonized society. so to reduce the income inequality. And this year, China's target, you may know, is to eliminate poverty in China. And now come to the 2020 and the government annual work report announced by the Prime Minister last Friday, just a few days ago, set no GDP growth target. I think this is another significant change that Chinese government, not only because of the uncertainty in the economy and the pandemic, but also they emphasize the quality of the growth instead of pursue the speed.
That's really interesting to see that sort of flexibility in the strategy over time, shifting from import substitution to export promotion, shifting from imitator to innovator. Just in terms of that last point you made about setting a no explicit growth strategy, how do you interpret that? What does quality of growth mean in the current context? Is that led and framed by the green agenda, a serious aspiration to engage with issues around climate change? Is it led by realism about the global economy? How do you explain your observation around China not setting an explicit growth target?
There has been a debate in China for quite some time about whether they need to set a kind of a GDP growth target. This is actually very important for many developing countries, because when they want to, shift to another level from the middle income country to be a high income country, they need some momentum and speed. So that's why there has been a pursuit of the certain speed, like 6 or 7% over the time, so that China can avoid the middle income trap. However, they realize one is sustainable development, and the second is about the quality of development. Instead of driven by investment, by resources input, and the country should, that's not sustainable, and the country should pursue a development strategy driven by knowledge, by innovation, and also greener and also more harmonized. And this year, I think the trigger, really the pandemic triggered this kind of change, made them to make their mind. This time is people first. So main emphasis first is about guaranteed employment, job creation. People have maintain the living standards, and then a green transformation. So that's the consideration behind this.
Fantastic. I'd now like to turn, if we could, to how you see the relationship between China's growth strategy and the rest of the world. So in general terms, I suppose China is a country that is emerging. It's a rising superpower. It's catching up with the United States. In some areas, there are arguments that it may have already overtaken. How do you see China's growth strategy and its relationship to the global context?
A very good question. The Chinese economy and the rest of the world, I think they are deeply interdependent. As I mentioned earlier, China's trade to GDP ratio is around 30%, 40%, and not only much higher than other developing countries, but also higher than many of the rich countries. Look at the trade GDP ratio of the US is much lower than this. So China now is the world's largest producer and the largest market, but also it's a competitor to some of the countries at different stages. So its growth strategy has significant implication for the rest of the world. With China transformed to be an innovation-driven economy and a more domestic consumption-driven, focused, and also a more greener development model, and use less resources. And I think this means first, China will gradually become a knowledge creator and contributor, and the public goods contributor, provider to the global society. And also this China's kind of rebalancing towards a more domestic consumption driven will also kind of give more market space for other countries if they can reposition them well. Also this will mean less consumption of energy and less emission in the environment. But also this means the competition will shift between China and other industrialized countries. And I have a paper published in World Development with Rafi Kaplinsky. We find out the competition in the 80s and the 90s was mainly between China and the low-income countries. Since 2000, is China between the middle-income countries, and gradually now it's become between China and some of the industrialized countries. So yeah, so the relationship of, we can see the relocation of the global value chains has actually is kind of evolving all the time,
It's very interesting to hear about that balance in a way between competition and cooperation, that there is this underlying interdependence on the one hand, and a need to build engagement, and that can play a role in contributing global public goods, particularly as China engages with the knowledge economy. But I suppose for some industrialized societies in the West, China is being viewed as an economic competitor. The United States in particular, with the current administration, is very much taking that view. But China obviously finances a huge part of the US national debt. It owns a significant amount of equity in big Western corporations in the United States, in Europe. And the US has basically, at a rhetorical level at least, started a trade war with China. Is American concern justified, or should Chinese growth be viewed as an opportunity for all?
No, I don't think the trade war is justified. It's not only me saying that, and many economists in the US criticizes the Trump's trade war, and also many educated people in the US. I think they understand this, because the trade war hurts the people and the business on both sides, and the increased prices will be, the cost will be imposed on the consumers in both countries. So it's not good for anybody. And actually, the trade war is kind of superficial phenomenon. It's an excuse. Behind this, I think it's some of the US politicians' worry and anxiety about China's rise and the threat they feel. Is China's rise a threat to them? I think to look at the future, because China currently is still, the gap between China and the US still fairly large. So looking at the future, and I think it will be good to look at the past, look at history, and look at culture. In the Chinese culture, there are two main stream thoughts that influence the society and the governors. One is Taoism, and another is Confucianism. The Taoism emphasizes harmony and coexistence. Maybe many people have seen the black and the white symbol of the yin yang, and in that circle there are white and black coexist, and that yin yang coexist actually is the main and the coexisting and the harmony between people, between different forces, between nature and the people, has been the emphasis of the Taoism over thousands of years. And then the Confucianism advocates respect and also a kind of compliance, respects to the superior and compliance to the rules and etc. So that's the culture that influenced the Chinese society for so many years. It has consequences, and but I think, in my view, China's rise, I don't think China will behave very aggressively to eliminate other countries and become the only one in the globe, on the earth. So, and also I also don't think China will abandon the existing global governance system and build its own. That's not kind of historically that the Chinese normally will think in that way. But like, unfortunately, some politicians in the US, because the culture in the US are more competitive, so they are using their thinking to make kind of judgment or prediction of China, what China will do, will behave in the future. I think it's unfortunate. More kind of communication is needed. No, I will think, also now there are people worry about what the US now will kind of give them pressures to the allies and isolate China. But I also don't think China will be dismantled like the former Soviet Union because of the history. That's a country of, at least the written history has 3,600 years. And over this long period, basically it's a unified nation. So I think it will keep as one country and seek the way forward. Then in my view about China's growth, whether it's an opportunity to other countries, I think China's growth provides large market to foreign producers. It also provides alternative sources of investment and technology to other countries, especially when some of the rich countries have difficulties, it provides alternatives. And it also is a voice to the existing global governance system, a new voice representing the developing countries. So I think it is an opportunity to others, although it is a newly rising power. It is still learning how to, become a global leader or a major player. So do not expect it does everything perfectly at this stage, given there are differences also in culture and also in values. So yeah.
Very interesting. And I suppose one area we should focus on is the implications for development. So in terms of China's role in the rest of the world, it obviously plays a crucial role in investment and technology transfer in lots of emerging markets around the world. So what role do you see China playing in regions like Africa through its Belt and Road strategy, for example? And how important is that role likely to become in the aftermath of COVID-19? Global recession is going to affect global governance and multilateralism. It's going to affect Western countries' engagement with low and middle income countries. Will China continue to play, do you think, a really active role in engaging emerging markets in Africa and beyond?
Yeah, a quick answer is I think China will continue to play an active role in engaging the developing world. China's role in Africa has been a topic of debate, and there are controversial evidences and arguments. I think that's not surprising because its impact is multifaceted given the various channels at play and the great variation of the African countries on the continent. There are 60 nations on the continent. And also there are different players, Chinese players in the African continent, in addition to only multinationals like in Africa. That's different from the Western engagement. There are a lot of medium and small sizes, even micro firms, Chinese firms engaged, active in Africa. And there are state-owned and there are privately owned and Chinese, and also there are Chinese multinationals too. So I think there will be in different contexts we may see different impact, but overall at a high level, the recent picture is that China now is the largest foreign investor in Africa between 2014 and 2018. And also China has been the main export market for African producers since 2012. And the main source of imports for African countries since 2007. So it is a major foreign player, have deep engagement and increasing engagement with Africa. There were some more criticism of China's engagement in Africa, but in recent years, we see more research, scientific academic research evidence coming out, giving a more objective analysis, and we see more results suggesting a more positive role of China played in Africa as an investor, a financier, a job creator, importer, and also source of technology transfer. Like DFID has funded a series of research about China's engagement in Africa too. They recently had a synthesis. And my own research in Africa in the past 8-10 years suggests that Chinese investment in Africa has similar financing effect as that of the US OFDI in Africa. But it has greater job creation effect because the labor-intensive technology Chinese companies use, and the greater productivity effects in Africa in the manufacturing sector because their technology are more close level to the African level, and the African workers and the entrepreneurs more easier to master and learn from Chinese technology. So Chinese has been a major player in technology transfer in Africa, both manufacturing sector and in the agriculture sector. That's traditionally, yeah. And what the BRI will do, the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it will broaden the engagement from aid and the foreign direct investment to more collaboration in science, technology, and innovation collaboration. Also, they were talking about digital Silk Road. So I think BRI will broaden the engagement between China and Africa. And the COVID-19, the pandemic, on the one hand, will make the BRI initiative more important for Africa because the developed countries are also badly hit by the pandemic, by the COVID-19. So their capacity to make deep financial engagement will be affected, including the multinationals too. However, I have to say the international political environment for China has deteriorated rapidly in the recent 2 months. This plus the increasing US hostility towards China. Last week, the White House published a report stating a fundamental revaluation of the US-China relationship. So all this means political risks for BRI initiative and the investment increases. So, and the Chinese government will face a backlash domestically if the risks are still high and they don't make any adjustment in the strategy. So China will certainly continue to engage actively with the BRI and with the African countries, but these uncertainties in the international political environment will affect. So the future, I think, not only depends on China, not only depends on US, but also depends on how EU, the European Union, and Africa will handle the pandemic and how they will handle the pressure from the US. That needs some political wisdom to handle that. Yeah, so yeah, I think that there are uncertainties too. Yeah.
And I suppose that's the question. The uncertainty created particularly by the COVID-19 context means that in a way there's even more demand and need for Chinese capital in the world, but it's arguably a smaller pot of capital that's available. I mean, you've written in your own work about China's role in global economic recovery in the context of the 2008-9 financial crisis. Even in that context, which also was in the aftermath of a pandemic on a much smaller scale, China's growth took a major hit, and that had knock-on effects elsewhere in the world. Now, China's a major creditor country to the rest of the world, and public debt around the world is escalating dramatically. So what effect do you think the global recession is going to have on China and some of these relationships? Given that China will be affected by that recession, can it still be part of the economic solution in the ways that you described with respect to 2008-9?
I think that's a very good question to bring us, looking back to 2008 and the 9 global financial crisis. That crisis, took place after the SARS, but originally was originated in the US financial market. And China's growth was hit, and the government has introduced a stimulus package, which was 3 trillion, the stimulus package, and heavy investment in infrastructure and create demand for the global products into China. And through that kind of linkage, will provide some growth engines to the whole global economic recovery. But of course, that stimulus package has some, later consequence too, because the surplus production capacity is one of it. And this year, the COVID-19 hit China heavily in the first quarter. The growth rate, the GDP growth rate in China was minus 6.8%. And it was predicted normally is kind of 6.3, 6.4% in the first quarter. And so the overall negative effect of the COVID-19 on Chinese growth was minus 13%. However, China recovered very quickly because of the very stringent social distancing and various policy measures. So it recovered quickly. I had a revision class with my student last Friday, and my student, Oxford student, told me he's now in Shanghai, and it was just as normal. He told me it's just as normal, and they have found jobs, and they would start their job soon in June after the final exam. So I think China's recovery will provide stable demand for the global production. It will also stabilize the global supply chain, especially given the China's very important role in manufacturing. And OFDI, outward FDI from China will continue. So all these are positive spillovers, or even a stabilizer to the global economy. So I think China's recovery will definitely be a part of the economic solution.
Fantastic. To everyone listening, we'll soon come to audience questions. If you do have questions from the audience, feel free to enter them in the chat box, and we'll come to them and read out some of them shortly. But I've just got a few follow-up questions. One of the things you mentioned was the political context of China's role in the world, and in a way how unfortunate it is that the Trump administration is seeing China's role in a negative light, in spite of the advice of many US-based economists, for instance. Now, I suppose one of the reasons why we see that backlash, partly against China, but against globalization in the United States, in Europe, is because of rising structural unemployment in Europe, in the United States, around the world. And the irony is that a lot of that seems to be driven by the decline in labor-intensive manufacturing. In the US, the UK, Germany, you see the regions in which populist nationalism is taking hold, where there's the greatest public alienation, are often those that had the strongest manufacturing base. Now, manufacturing has shifted a little bit to China through offshoring, for instance, from Europe and beyond. And China's invested heavily in manufacturing through its Made in China 2025 strategy, for instance. How do you see the global competition over manufacturing looking from a Chinese perspective? And do you think there's a concern that the erosion of manufacturing in the West actually is part of what changes the global political landscape? Does China need to provide a way of also ensuring that manufacturing stays alive in other parts of the world, given the political consequences of its demise?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. First, I want to just clarify a misunderstanding of the Made in China 2025 strategy. This was in some way inspired by the German Industry 4.0. And the idea was proposed by the Ministry of Industry and Information, and somehow got the support from the State Council. And because it showed some exciting ambition and went to the media, but it was mainly largely a slogan type of strategy policy, instead of policy backed up by very heavy investment. It was more famous and significant outside China than it was within the Chinese government system. And the trend of the reshoring manufacturing activities in the West has started for some years. I think the rising unemployment in the labor-intensive sector in the industrialized countries is worrying. So the US has its own advanced manufacturing program, which was initiated since the Obama administration. And later, Germany has the Industry 4.0, etc. And now the COVID-19, I think, has deepened this trend about the reshoring or relocation of the manufacturing activities. Although I think this reshoring will mainly be driven by the technology and the industrial robots. I'm wondering whether how much it will really create job opportunity. And such a global competition, how the Chinese see this, I think there are three points here. First is, I think the globalization should be more inclusive and need to be reformed. And also there is a need of rebalancing. China's kind of reorientation towards domestic consumption and also upgrading from the labor-intensive sectors, etc., I think is a response to that. Secondly, some people in China are worried about this relocation. I have to be honest. If we look, because of the employment, because of the jobs linked to it, look at the coastal region near Hong Kong, in the Pearl River Delta, many of the factories still closed because of lack of order. So that's another group of people and opinion. And the third group of opinion, more similar to the first one, is they see China should take this challenge and turn it as an opportunity. So push China for innovation, structural change, and technology upgrading. So all these are very difficult things. With this external pressure to push these reforms and upgrading. So the government introduced the new infrastructure in end of February, which is emphasizing more digital technology, next generation. Yeah.
And your own work focuses on technology and innovation. And as you said earlier, for a long time, China was seen as lagging behind the US in terms of innovation. Its strategy was based much more on imitation. Now this is really changing, and we see Chinese companies such as Huawei now leading the way in areas like 5G. We see the potential for knowledge public goods, as you emphasized earlier. What is the Chinese view of innovation? What's specific about Chinese innovation? And what needs to happen for Chinese innovation to break through into Western markets? How does that work from a Chinese perspective?
China, now I think innovation has moved to the center of its development strategy. As you said, it's kind of determined to transform it to be an innovator and an innovation country. And this year we can see is very heavy emphasis on the basic research and the fostering of novel innovation. So innovation in China in the past has very much been learning based. And also there is a term, Chinese term called secondary innovation, which is assimilation, adaptation, and integration of the external knowledge that they learned. And now they very much emphasize on the creation of novel innovation. At this point, China's emphasis on innovation, I think now it's at its historical high. I think it's historic high. No point in China's history that the whole nation puts so much emphasis on innovation because of the trade war, because the supply of the chips to the Chinese major telecommunication companies was kind of cut off by the Trump administration. So this determination is high, but it will be a hard and a long process, because this means culture, institutional and historical, there are historical reasons, cultural change, institutional change, and the foster of talents with creative and open free thinking, it will be a hard non-process. And the Chinese innovation in the future, it will contribute to the global society. It is a public good anyway, no matter how you protect it with patents or it is public good, will generate spillovers. And China will not replace others. I think it will, in the immediate and medium term, it will provide an alternative to the technology created in the industrialized countries. But it will be more kind of closer to the developing country context.
And you mentioned this process of difficult transformation. I think one thing that many people would probably seek clarification on is what the Chinese economic model actually is underlying its growth strategy. So around the world, people are questioning what the future of capitalism is in the context of climate change, in the context of COVID-19. And China has a historically complex relationship to capitalism. I mean, it is in a way a socialist capitalist economy. What is the Chinese view of capitalism? How's it evolving? And is there anything in that model that the rest of the world could potentially now learn from as it seeks alternative, almost welfare capitalist models?
Oh, this is a very good question, and you gave a very accurate description of the capitalism in China. Yes, China has a complex relationship, really complex relationship to capitalism. China call it a socialist capitalism economy with Chinese characteristics. So China sees the advantage provided by the market mechanism. So it has a strong state, but it continues to emphasize the important role of market in resource allocation. The government, the president, the prime minister continue to mention this, to emphasize the role of the market. Even last Friday's government work report again need to emphasize the role of the market. And they put the implementation of the trade agreement with the US in the government work report. So I think that's a signal to say they are determined to reform. Otherwise, they don't need to include implementation of a trade agreement in an annual report, but they did. They did. I think that's a signal showing the determination of the reforms. But China is kind of combination of the state role, balancing the role of the state and the market, and try to give a kind of appropriate combination. If you ask what other countries can learn from China's experience, I think China is a learning state. The Chinese government is a learning government. I have not seen much governments in the world would openly recognize there are limitations of their system amidst the strengths of other systems, and have a willingness and even set delegations and groups across the globe to learn from others, and then go back and make modifications and adapt its version. So I think this type of learning mind is lack of in some of the countries. And especially recently, I see the speeches of political leaders full of ideological slogans, and the lack of the reflections on the limitations and the weakness of their own system and the need to reform. And I think this learning in attitude and to combine what is good to produce something that work for the country. I think that's other country could learn from China.
And just to follow up on that, I suppose seeing China as a learning economy and society is quite interesting. I suppose there's been this process of economic liberalization that's taken place, particularly from 1978 onwards. What reforms do you think are still needed to ensure the greatest benefits from a market economy? So, for instance, to what extent do you think political reforms will be needed to balance political liberalism with market liberalism?
I think this is a topic has been talked in China for a long time. This has come to a very deep water stage. Now still I think need to push. I think China has always used a gradual approach in terms of reform. About kind of emphasizes the role of the market. Easy to say and really need to implement and do it thoroughly. You have to really fight against the stakeholders, who, especially those who are powerful in the existing system, who benefit from the non-market system. And this is not easy. There was a report, jointly by the State Council, the Development Research Center and the World Bank on the reforms of the SOEs get a huge backlash from the SOE sector. So the rigidity in the system to get through it. And so the opening up is really good for China. The opening up is really for China to bring the pressure and push forward the reforms.
Fantastic. This is all fascinating, Xiaolan. We're going to open up to questions. So anyone who's got questions, please just type them in the chat box. We can't bring audience members onto the screen, but we can take your questions via chat. So please type them in. And while people are thinking of questions, just one final question for you, Xiaolan. Your next book is called Innovation Under the Radar, which I believe is forthcoming. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, I will tell you quickly. First, this book based my 10 years work on innovation in Africa, mainly in Ghana, Tanzania, and Kenya, and includes both field work and a large survey, national survey. It answers the question, are African business innovative? If so, in what ways? And it challenges the views that innovation is somebody else's business in the developing countries. In Africa, especially in the low-income countries, they think innovation is not really relevant for them, including in among some policymakers. And the book argues that innovation is not only the outcome, it's not the outcome, but a means for development. So it is a means for development. Every country should innovate now. And the book looks at the nature of innovation in Africa, its sources and the transmission mechanisms through which the innovation are diffused within and to Africa, and to Africa. It looks at the types of innovation and find out the type of innovation in Africa are not those that can be captured by the traditional innovation indicators in the existing literature. So I call them innovation under the radar. They are learning-based, not laboratory-based. They are created under the constraints, resource constraints, skill constraints, institutional constraints. And so African firms innovate to survive. However, this type of innovation will not be sufficient for Africa to leapfrog the technological gap, especially in the era of the fourth industrial revolution.
Fantastic. Thank you, Xiaolan. We've got a number of questions coming in. There's one in the chat box that says, to what extent do you see the recent economic sanctions from the US to add many Chinese technology firms to the entity list? How do you see that? How do you think China will strategize to tackle the risk implications of US sanctions? Yeah.
Now, US adds several waves of adding Chinese, not only firms, research institutes, even universities to the US entity list. Some are in the defense industry, but some are not. The reasons is only, if I look at their website, the reason is only they pose a kind of a risk to the US. To the US, because it take a lead in certain sector or certain industry. I think this will add. This is from as a scholar working on innovation. This is not good for the whole global innovation system. Innovation is more and more open, collaborative undertaking. Adding firms and the research institutes and universities to the list add a lot of disruption to the collaboration, and especially the psychological pressure to the scientist, and also hindered a lot of future collaboration, including currently the collaboration in vaccination, in drug development. All these are being affected, and the scientists working under pressure. It's not good for the knowledge creation for the whole global community.
We've got a couple of related questions that are about China's innovation strategy. And one question is a historical question that asks, what were the main steps that China has taken to go from a technology imitator to an innovator? And a related question is, in terms of Chinese innovation, what will be the main priority areas that China will address? And what kinds of opportunities might this create for companies and institutions in the UK or elsewhere to collaborate? So in terms of innovation, what was the historical step from imitator to innovator? And in terms of the present day, what's the innovation focus and what opportunities do you think that creates?
Yeah, China's historical steps from, to transform from an imitator to an innovator, first is to encourage, like in China, there was, like since 2006, there was an encouragement of indigenous innovation. Many people may have heard about that. Although there are different definitions and also some misunderstanding in the interpretations of the concept. I think this indicates China's shift towards very relaxed to rely on foreign technology transfer to in-house R&D and to building up their own indigenous innovation capabilities. Although these indigenous innovation capabilities still should be built up through the open innovation in a collaborative mode. So this openness in innovation, in collaboration, still one of the emphasis of the Chinese government. So emphasize building up innovation capacity within China, and also collaborate, enhance international collaboration, and also China used to attract international talents, including the diasporas back to China. Maybe people heard about various talents programs, etc. So those are things have been used, and also reforms of the STI system. What China has done is reform of the system. China's innovation STI system previously was followed the Soviet Union system. And in the mid-80s, it marketized a lot of research institutions, put them into the market, and led them to find research funding and collaborate with the industries and firms and develop. So the reforms is another area, and also emphasize technology transfer, like from university commercialization, this university industry linkage. So these are the steps that China has taken, and what China now priority again. First is again the reform the system. Need to continue to reform the system. The problem in China sometimes is they overdone, either far left, or then come back to far right, and find the right kind of degree of incentives, right type of incentives, and the appraisal system and the policies, and the right level of support. I think it's not only right or left. A lot of experience, good practices, knowledge, science in it. So this is one of the area continue to reform, including the market, further marketization that lets the private sector and also in terms of relocation of the R&D resources, let it go more to the private sector, to the small and medium enterprises. The reforms is one thing to continue to foster the talents, and with creative, open mind and free thinking. That's another very difficult challenge that China has to tackle. Thirdly, continue opening up, open innovation system, collaboration, and really fundamentally, especially like this current international environment, which is gets more kind of unfavorable to China, to really continue this international opening up, showing its commitment, and provide real platforms and funding support for collaboration, and And they need also to think about new ways about talent exchange, etc. Yeah.
Fantastic. We've also got a couple of really interesting questions about the relationship with the United States that are related. One is, will China challenge the US dollar as the global reserve currency? And a second related one is, do you think the Chinese and American economic cooperation will unravel completely as a result of the Trump administration? And to what extent does China's development rely upon continued access to US markets and technology?
Yeah, I think first, will China kind of challenge US dollar? I don't think so. Chinese RMB is so far not an international currency yet. So to challenge US dollar, I don't think so in the foreseeable future. But China wants to internationalize its RMB and to be one of the international currencies that people will use, like the Japanese yen, etc. That's something that I think we'll be able to achieve. However, the Chinese central bank has been put a lot of emphasis on the digital currency. That in this area, in terms at government level, China is a leader. If there is a breakthrough in the digital currency, then China may be able to catch up. In this world, in this aspect, but not in the traditional sense about the Chinese yuan challenging the US dollar. Because behind the US dollar is not just economy. I think political or military power, all this involved to support it. Then how can China guarantee the access to US technology and US market? I think the trade war was not initiated by the Chinese government. China does not want a trade war. And even Trump administration asked, a very big price from China, and China tried hard to reach an agreement. Even within China, some people will think, that agreement won't be able to achieve because China compromised too much. But that means China wants to end the trade war and maintain a workable relationship. And the competition, collaboration plus competition will be the right mode. And look at the evolution of the world history. You see the world power from Portugal to Spanish, to Spain, to Netherlands, to the UK, to the US. There are that's the wheels of the history. I hope gradually, some people in the US will gradually realize that's the wheel of the history. And there could be kind of peaceful transition and coexistence. So I hope the two countries can maintain at least a workable relationship and collaborate in the areas like global challenge, like fighting the pandemic, to benefit the global community.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for just one more broad question. There's a couple on the chat box about the relationship between China's economic role in the wider world and its political influence. So one question is, will the rise of China also mean a spread of its political ideologies? So will the Chinese political model be exported with its economic model? And a related one is, how do you see China's efforts on guaranteeing that its global presence is sustainable and fair? For instance, the way in which China is engaging with the impact of road constructions on the Amazon region of the world and the effects on indigenous populations. So I think there's a sort of interest in hearing about, with the growing economic role, what does that mean for the spread of China's political approach in areas like political freedoms and the environment?
Yeah, I think China's growing economic influence will inevitably, bring some influence for its political model. So if I say no, I think that's not really objective. However, to what extent, in what way, I don't think the Chinese kind of political model, even political model, one way is about kind of, in terms of freedom, and another way is the role of the state. I think first is China has not and cannot really kind of impose a political model on other country, because the countries can choose what they want. There is a negotiation in this, and what they can negotiate is all the economic deals rather than the political model. What China, other country might learn from China is how to combine the role of the state with market. But I don't think other countries will learn from China about, on the freedom aspect. So I think that will be a selective process, a mutual selective process. And China has been, I think, since 1950s, has kind of non-alliance principle as the fundamental principle of its foreign policy. So it's not kind of forming any alliances, and I don't think it will kind of impose forcefully on any political kind of model on other countries. Secondly, about China's engagement with other countries, like you mentioned, Amazon and the indigenous, its impact on the indigenous society. I think that is an area China need to learn more, and it should continue to improve to make its overseas engagement, especially foreign direct investment and Belt Road, more acceptable, welcomed by the local community. So it's more sustainable, it's more inclusive, and so this is an area China, I think, recognized, and about, it's kind of in the learning process, So this year's, last Friday's government work report mentioned the Belt and the Road will be more high quality and mutual beneficial. I think in China, in such government kind of document, one word has a lot of underlying sentences behind it. Yeah, I think this mutual beneficial means welcomed by the host country and the host community.
Xiaolan, this is a conversation that could run and run. Thank you so much for your contribution. We've reached the end of our hour, but you've provided a huge amount of clarity on a lot of very complex issues. I've certainly learned a huge amount as someone with very little knowledge or even certainly not expertise on China. I think you've answered and engaged with not only my questions, but those of people tuning in from home. So thank you so much for such clarity, such focus, such engagement. It's a real work of translating the dynamics and complexities of the Chinese economy and its role in the wider world to a diverse audience such as this. So thank you very much for your time. It's been a terrific contribution. We're delighted to have had you. And for those of you who are at home, please join us again for the next Oxford Development Talk, which will be next Monday at 2 p.m. British Standard Time. And it will be delivered by Professor Nandini Guptu on the topic of space, class, and social distancing in the Indian city. So we'll move from China to India, but retain a contemporary focus on issues still related to COVID-19. But thanks again, Xiaolan, and thank you to everyone who's joined us, listened and engaged. Bye-bye.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks everybody for all the wonderful questions. Thank you.